We are here to have a conversation with Jim Ledbetter about his new book, Unwarranted Influence, Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Military-Industrial Complex. Great to have you with us, Jim.
Thanks, David.
So Jim Ledbetter is an author and editor. He's the author of two previous books, one on the death of public broadcasting and one on the short and absurd life of the industry standard magazine. He's been a writer for numerous publications. He was recently the editor of Big Money, the Slate Business publication, and is now editor in charge of Reuters.com. So I guess the way to get off into the conversation, Jim, is just to ask you what prompted you to write a book about the military-industrial complex at a time when you don't really hear that phrase very often.
Yeah, I think in part it's the fact that we haven't heard a lot about it for the last few decades that prompted me to write it, although I will say that in roughly the same time period as I began, I think the term began to have a little bit of a renaissance, largely due to the prolonged wars in Iraq and to a lesser extent Afghanistan. I've tried to do three things in the book, and this is the lovely cover. Unwarranted Influence, Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Military-Industrial Complex. Try to do three things. The first is to explore the historical antecedents, the intellectual roots of this notion that there is some negative power that comes from the confluence of private business and public policy in the form of military spending and military organization. The second is to examine very specifically the political context that led Eisenhower to give the speech that introduced this concept 50 years ago today, on the day that we're recording this, which is to say January 17th, 1961, his final full speech as President of the United States. And the third idea was to explain how this concept of a military-industrial complex, which after all is fluid, elastic, undefined by the man who coined it, to look at how it has evolved in the half century since the speech was delivered. So that's the goal of the book.
Let's start with the political context of the time. You know, Eisenhower, of course, had previously criticized military spending. He famously gave that speech in 1953, I believe, in which he said that every rocket launched, every tank built signifies a theft from those in need. And here he is, 7 years later, criticizing military spending in a speech much more famous. But what led Eisenhower to give the military-industrial complex speech, and why was he in office for so long and did so little about the growth of this complex?
Right. Those are two great questions combined. Let me see if I can separate them out. The first has to do with Eisenhower's historical relationship to the military, which is complex, if you'll forgive the term. It's nuanced and probably more sophisticated than just about anybody who's ever occupied the White House, certainly in the modern era. Eisenhower was the son of Mennonite pacifists, grew up in a household where war was as much a sin as any other sin on the list, but of course became after a somewhat undistinguished military career in his early days, became the famous general, the leader of all the Allied troops during World War II, and largely credited with winning World War II for the Allies. And as you point out, on his watch, he took office in January of 1953. Just for example, the United States nuclear arsenal grew from about 1,000 warheads when he started to about 23 or 24,000 when he gave the speech. So that's an immense explosion of our nuclear capability, which makes you wonder to some degree about the sincerity of the speech, or that it might have served multiple purposes. But to get to your point about the 1953 speech, which is generally known as the Chance for Peace speech, this was delivered in April of 1953, shortly after Eisenhower had taken office. shortly after the death of Joseph Stalin, at a point where, maybe the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union did not have to seem or did not have to be as frozen and as contentious as it later became. There was a small window there where they thought, well, depending on who takes over in Stalin's wake, we might be able to make some inroads there. And so it is an incredible speech. It's very idealistic. As you say, he says, that we pay for the cost of one bomber could build 100 brick schools. We could provide drinking water for what we pay for an aircraft carrier, et cetera, et cetera. Fantastic speech, broadcast around the world, handed out in pamphlet form in many, many countries, and essentially nothing became of it. Now, nothing became of it in part because when Khrushchev took over from Stalin, that country expressed as little interest in kind of the thaw in Cold War relations as Stalin had. And secondly, it's not really clear that Eisenhower and his administration were really fully behind some of the more idealistic plans in that speech. And I think you can read the farewell address and its invocation of a military-industrial complex almost as a confession on Eisenhower's part, an admission that in his loftier goals, in his goals of preserving peace or creating the conditions for peace, he had failed the country somewhat. And he said as much toward the latter part of the speech.
But there was a thaw during the last part of the 1950s, again, with the relations with the Soviet Union. I can't remember what the term was for that period, but it wasn't quite detente, but there was a thaw, right?
There were discussions about peaceful coexistence, right? That was the organizing phrase at the time, and I think that if those were ever going to get anywhere, the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, the launch of the Sputnik satellite in October of 1957, the release almost simultaneously with the Sputnik launch of the Gaither report, a supposedly confidential document that said that the Soviet Union had either surpassed or was going to soon surpass the United States in its nuclear capabilities, the explosion of a hydrogen bomb on behalf of the Soviets. All of these meant that whatever efforts, whatever possibilities for peaceful coexistence really didn't come about. And that, I think, is a very important context for the farewell speech that's the topic of my book. That is to say, it's hard for us to think about it now. We tend to think of Republicans as being pro-military spending and Democrats as being, anti-war and sometimes anti-defense spending. But in the late 1950s, early 1960s, the situation was largely reversed. Eisenhower felt that the truth about actual American Soviet capabilities was being distorted, that the information in the Gaither report was false, and he knew it to be false because we were collecting on-the-ground data about Soviet nuclear capabilities in the form of the data that came from the U-2 spy planes. The problem was that Eisenhower couldn't discuss any of that publicly because, of course, it was top secret. But at the same time, you had the Democratic Party, and remember, you had both Kennedy and Johnson in the Senate at this time, made a big deal about a so-called missile gap. That we were falling behind. The Gaither report proved it. Sputnik proved it because here they were able to launch a satellite, and it was only a matter of time before something nuclear could be attached to that satellite. And so it looked like we were behind, and therefore there was this drumbeat in which top military people, the people on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, particularly people in the Air Force, were arguing for much, much more military spending. And Eisenhower, in every fiber of his being, knew that we if we tried to sort of spend ourselves, dollar for ruble with everything that the Soviet Union was spending, that we would bury the very ideas that the country was founded on. We could have a command economy. We could mobilize the economy in the way that it was done during World War II. We could have 80 or 90% of our productive forces aimed toward the military, but that would defeat the purpose. We would, as it were, kill democracy in order to save it.
Well,
you didn't want to see that come about.
You point out in your book that at the time of Eisenhower's speech, military spending was more than 50% of all federal outlays, compared to under 20% today, and was 10% of GDP compared to under 4% today. So we're talking about a lot of money going to the military complex at that time, and in a way, it's sort of like military spending was the healthcare of its time.
Or the entitlement programs, yeah, that's right, and this is precisely what Eisenhower was talking about. I mean, you have to keep in mind. I mean, the country was on 100% war footing by the end of World War II. There was a degree of sort of demilitarizing, decommissioning following the end of World War II in 1945, but then within just a couple of years, we get involved in the Korean conflict, which created a lot of spending. We make a commitment in the early days of the Eisenhower administration to a much more powerful, much more aggressive nuclear posture. There were, comparably very few nuclear weapons in the world before Eisenhower took office. All of this cost a lot of money, plus pensions for people who fought in World War II, plus a lot of academic research at this time was coming out of the Pentagon or the Atomic Energy Commission, and that was eating up a huge chunk of the education budget. That portion is much, much smaller today. The portion of military dollars going to United States universities for research, while of course it still exists, is much, much smaller than at Eisenhower's time. But from his point of view, looking 5, 10, 20 years into the future, it looked like those numbers would continue to go up, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why he issued this warning.
Let's go to this notion of unwarranted influence, which is, of course, the title of your book and a key theme of Eisenhower's speech, that this military-industrial complex, because of its power, was calling the shots, would continue to call the shots, its influence would grow, and that influence was antithetical to democracy. And so I guess the question for you is, how do you kind of document the influence of the military-industrial complex? I mean, it's easy enough to point to sort of the iron triangle between Congress and defense contractors and Pentagon keeping certain weapon systems alive. What about this broader notion of that complex really driving U.S. policy? How true was it then? Absolutely. How true is it now?
Yeah, well, when you look at the full text of the Eisenhower speech, it's very striking how much broader his critique was than we often think about it. When we think about it in this narrow question of sort of military spending and military lobbying, obviously that is a key component and certainly consistent with what Eisenhower was talking about. But he says in the speech that it has an economic effect, it has a political effect, he says even a spiritual effect. And those terms are very sweeping and kind of undefined by President Eisenhower. It took later observers and critics to kind of define those terms, and I think depending on how you define them, of course, this force is still in operation today. But I think there are a few concrete ways we can get our heads around it. One, this has become a concern for critics of the military-industrial complex, particularly since the 1990s, and it has to do with so-called add-ons. You have these weapon systems that nobody in the military says they want, and yet we're buying them anyway, sometimes lots of them. The most egregious example is the C-130 transport plane, a Lockheed Martin product that the Air Force, for about 2 decades, they asked for a total of 5 of these planes. They really didn't want them. They didn't seem to think they needed them. And instead, Congress authorized something like 250 of these planes. That suggests that something other than strict military need is behind the building of these weapons. Now, depending on how kind of conspiratorial you want to get about it, you could argue what those forces are, but they seem to be broader than the military itself.
Well, and that is a interesting question. Also, the role of Congress. Who's driving the military-industrial complex most aggressively in terms of allocating money for weapons that nobody wants, or wars that nobody wants? Is it Congress, or is it the defense contractors, or is it Pentagon officials? I mean, I know it varies across different cases, but where do you really where would you put most of the blame in terms of the sort of unwarranted influence or perverse effects of this power?
Well, I think it's the nefarious combination of the three, and you can sort of pin. I think there's an argument for pinning a greater responsibility on Congress because they are our elected officials. They're supposed to be our leaders. They ought to be able to deal with any problem of this kind in some kind of rational way. But the critique, and it remains a very powerful critique, is that this thing is what's behind Congress, right? It's not only in the form of campaign contributions and fundraising that's done on behalf of military contractors, but perhaps more importantly, the question of jobs in the districts. And this machinery was already in place by the time Eisenhower gave his speech, and it has only become much more sophisticated. Anytime you want to do the simplest thing, whether it's close a military base in New Jersey or kill a redundant fighter plane program, the contractors will come in and show each member of Congress, this is how many jobs are going to be lost in your district. This is the amount of money that's not going to be spent in your district anymore. And these are very, very powerful forces. Sometimes, of course, the constituents themselves want it, but this creates a kind of classic problem in political philosophy. It's almost a question of indifference to most Americans whether we build 10 fighter planes of a certain kind or we build 50 fighter planes. Most people are not in a position to assess the military necessity of one way or the other, but it's in a lot of people's interest, that a lot of insiders' interest that we build 50 instead of 10. The contractors, the people who work for that company, et cetera, they're shareholders, and so we get this sort of vast gap between the ability of one set of interests to get its way and the public interest to be able to express itself its way. That's what Eisenhower was talking about.
Right.
That constitutes unwarranted influence.
Of course,
on the broader question of causing wars, Eisenhower did not go so far as to say that it is private industry or congressional turf protection that causes wars. I think that critique, while some people certainly interpret the military-industrial complex that way, that's not really true to what he said. That actually harkens back to an earlier critique in the 1930s that was known as the Merchants of Death thesis, this notion that wars are either caused or prolonged by arms contractors working for a profit, often whom it leads to cost overruns. It leads to the manufacture of shoddy equipment that's sort of foisted onto people who have no competition. That I think Eisenhower was echoing that critique, but he never really articulated it.
But that critique was made later by people who, during the Vietnam War, took the military
and today, if you look at the Eugene Jarecki documentary "Why We Fight," that came out in, I believe, 2005, in the wake of the war in Iraq, it pretty much argues that it is the military contractors who are pushing us to fight wars, and certainly to fight longer wars than might otherwise be the case. Now,
how much merit do you give that argument?
Well, the proof of that thesis is going to depend on a lot of factors that many people won't agree with, right? I mean, you're not going to find a smoking gun document from Northrop Grumman that says, "Gosh darn it, if you don't, expand the war in Iraq." So it's kind of an ethos that's created, and certainly, I recorded a program this morning, and they were playing an ad that's been running for Northrop Grumman. About all the threats to our way of life, from hackers to the Chinese to rogue states, and really kind of putting the fear in people, and of course the obvious solution is spend billions of dollars more on weaponry. Well, I think we've learned, or we ought to have learned at this point, that despite arming ourselves at sort of record levels, it didn't help us prevent the attacks of September 11th. It has, if it's helping us in the Afghan and Iraq wars, it's kind of hard to see. Nobody who, when we went into Iraq 10 years ago, was talking about a 10-year conflict. Is that, is the prolonging of that conflict the direct results of military contracting? I don't know. Are a lot of contractors making tons of money? A good deal of the war effort these days are in private hands, right? In the hands of private contractors who are capable of making much more money than military professionals make. So there's been this transfer of our warfighting capability.
50% of the Americans in Afghanistan work for private contractors. It seems to me that the perverse, negative, unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex has played out less in terms of inciting or prolonging wars, and more in escalating the arms race during the 60s and through the 80s until the collapse of the Soviet Union. It seemed pretty clear that by pushing for these weapons systems that we maybe didn't need, that the military-industrial complex, that constellation of interest really led the United States to deploy more nuclear weapons than might otherwise have been the case, and that could have really inflamed, or did inflame, tensions with the Soviets. Certainly the Star Wars program, Strategic Defense Initiative, was partly a product of that influence of the military-industrial complex, and that very much unnerved the Soviets. It seems like the second negative effect has been in the influence in the arms trade, pushing for a looser export policy for U.S. weapons, and
absolutely,
and the United States is the lead exporter of weapons globally, and that has had a lot of negative effects. Could you talk about both of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with you on the question of nuclear weapons. Now, some people would say that was a feature, not a bug, right? That sort of breaking the back of the Soviet Union was a desirable goal, and in fact a planned goal within the military planning. I think that's a kind of rosy way of looking at it, and not one, frankly, that Eisenhower would have accepted, at least on those terms alone. As I mentioned before, Eisenhower was always concerned about the concept of a garrison state, the idea that we were leading toward a kind of more authoritarian society that would be dominated by the military, in which individuals had fewer and fewer rights, and where elections were sort of, more or less a ratification of what powerful interests wanted. And I don't think that the United States has become a garrison state, but I think you could make a case that in the post 9/11 period we've kind of backslid a bit, and just looking at the systemic use of torture in Iraq, the Guantanamo detentions, many of which people turned out to be innocent and had no recourse to due process for years at a time. This is something that would have troubled Eisenhower greatly. And then, as we mentioned, the privatization of warfare, leading to a very murky area in terms of accountability. So, yes, the nuclear part of it, but also these other parts of it that perpetuate the fear, that perpetuate the need to, or the perceived need to continue spending at levels that are just unknown prior to the period when Eisenhower was president. The second point, I think, is a critical one, and that has to do with the role of the United States as an arms merchant abroad. This was, when Eisenhower gave his speech 50 years ago, this was essentially unknown. The United States, of course, provided military aid to selected allies and was an important intelligence ally for Western Europe and other nations in our circle. But the notion of fighter planes, jet planes, missiles, guidance systems, these things being freely available on the market was just absolutely unknown. It would have been against the law. It's only in the early 1970s, coinciding, let's say, nicely with the beginning of the decline in spending on weaponry for the Vietnam War, that you suddenly get, the United States opening up the coffers or the offerings of its biggest military contractors to countries abroad. Now, they have to go through some checks with the State Department. There's still some degree of control over what you can export, but we're talking about now $40 billion a year in arms sales, which the United States is responsible for something like 2/3 of the entire global arms market. That has to be considered a function of the military-industrial complex at work, and one that is very little debated within Congress, even though, as you indicate, it clearly has foreign policy implications. Just to take a sort of timely example, we've been reading in recent days about the Chinese flying testing a stealth fighter. Maybe they did with authorization of the government. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it is stealthy. Maybe it isn't. We don't know. That's a very serious situation that the United States needs to confront, but it is clearly exacerbated by the billions of dollars that are sold every year to Taiwan. Now, you can argue we should be on one side or the other side of that debate, but in an earlier world, we would not have had, as a country, the sort of economic motivation to sell arms to Taiwan. So you've added a complexity to the situation that might well work against the interests of the United States. And there are countless other examples of this, particularly in the Middle East.
Well, and efforts to better regulate that arms trade have met a lot of resistance from the classic constellation of actors in the military-industrial complex. When Carter tried to reduce arms transfers abroad, he ran into just a buzzsaw of opposition, and that pretty much went nowhere. I mean, I think this is an example of that power in its rawest form. No congressperson wants to go back and say, we're not going to have that order of F-16s to, Pakistan or wherever, and lose all those jobs. And of course, the defense contractors have a huge interest there as well. So sane, right, more sensible voices are just kind of bulldozed aside by the military-industrial complex.
Right, and in case it's not obvious, it is the same companies. We're not talking about two different sets of companies, right? One that provides weapons for the United States and one that provides them abroad. So the coziness that existed before gets reinforced. The coziness that is between the military contractors, Congress, and the Pentagon, that only gets reinforced by these relationships abroad. So it's the same companies: Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, a few others. They are the one, Lockheed Martin. They are the ones doing the bulk of arms sales abroad. So by helping those companies, if that's the right term, make money abroad, we are only strengthening the role that they play in this power triad that Eisenhower warned us about.
It's also striking how hard it has been to really shift the direction of U.S. nuclear strategy since the end of the Cold War. The efforts to dramatically reduce nuclear arsenals, to pass a comprehensive test ban treaty, have really not gone as far as you might think, given that the Soviet Union is no more. The Clinton administration tried a major change in nuclear weapons strategy and didn't get very far. And Obama's ran into some of the same problems.
Yeah, and you see something similar happening in Great Britain, where talk about a country that really doesn't have an obvious need for nuclear weapons anymore. And when Tony Blair was prime minister, they talked about sort of eliminating one entire class of weapons, only to then say, but we will modernize them and build new ones. Or this is the game now. We've got these old rusty weapons sitting around. They're no good. We'll get rid of them. But we can't, let our guard down. I mean, it is sort of absurd on its face. One wonders, and I guess you don't get answers to this because it's classified, but like the weapons that we have, and we are in the process of getting rid of some, but we've still got a lot left over. Where are they pointed? The command and control of nuclear weapons is not something that you can just sort of flick a switch. Yeah. They've got to be oriented towards someplace, and I kind of wonder, is it Iraq? Is it Russia still?
Space.
Is it China? Is it Brazil? Is it Venezuela? Where are these weapons pointed?
You mentioned, Jim. You mentioned. I'm sure they're pointed at the nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union.
Right.
You mentioned earlier that there'd been a real flip in the way the different political parties handled military spending and defense issues. That back in the 50s, it was the Republican Party that was really, the fiscally conservative party that didn't want to spend too much on the military, didn't want an overly aggressive posture abroad. And now, there's very much been a flip with the Republicans being the advocates of higher defense spending. Republicans are the opponents of that START treaty that Obama managed to pass. I wonder, though, do you see any, with the rise of this fiscal conservatism becoming, much more intense, with the Tea Party, do you see some criticisms within the right of all of this military spending?
Yes, this is a great question, and I guess I would say it's inconclusive as of yet, but yes. There are strains within the Republican Party, including the Tea Party and, let's say, Tea Party-friendly Republicans, as well as kind of the libertarian wing of the party that are beginning to come together and focus on military spending. And I should preface that by saying there have always been, since the 1960s, there have always been members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are willing to take on military spending as a problem in and of itself. They have been somewhat lone wolfish, somewhat without, large influence, but people like William Proxmire in the 1970s and John McCain in the 1980s and 1990s was very vocal critic of what he considered to be excessive and wasteful military spending. So at least that chunk of it, they were willing to take on. But as I said, sort of voices in the wilderness. You have those voices again today. Senator Tom Coburn has been making a lot of noise lately about military spending. Some of the Tea Party candidates who are a little more independent-minded have been talking about it. And I have also found with the publication of my book about the military-industrial complex, a great deal of interest among the libertarian right, the Cato Institute and some of those folks. They are, true. When the ones that are true to their principles look at military spending as just one part of a broader, portion of government spending that they oppose. And I think intellectually that's right. It's been interesting to me, David, in researching this book, a lot of the rhetoric that got built up around the military-industrial complex during the Vietnam period, this sort of very angry, furious rhetoric aimed at the Pentagon, ends up being very similar to the rhetoric that the Tea Party uses against government spending as a whole, right? Starve the beast is one. The Pentagon has gotten so out of control. It was said in 1969 that it's immune to reform. Congress is not in a position to reform it anyway. The only way to fully kind of get hold of it is to cut off its oxygen, right? The exact same metaphors, exact same rhetoric that the Tea Party uses about government as a whole. One of the features of American politics, if you want to call it that, is the people who are really concerned about defense spending tend not to be concerned about other forms of government spending, and vice versa.
Right.
The people who are really concerned about government spending tend to ignore the role that defense spending plays. But maybe all the attention that's come lately to our debt and our deficits, maybe that will help rein in government spending on the military. But I think it's a little early to say that we have the building blocks of genuine reform.
Well, it's interesting, you so often hear that it's the right that has led the attack on government for 30 years, which is largely true. But of course, if you go back to the 1970s, it was as you say, the left that was really popularizing the idea that you could not trust government officials, that these institutions were out of control in terms of, or at least the military, the defense and intelligence institutions were out of control. And so in that sense, of course, both the left and the right share blame in the rise of anti-government sentiments, even though the right shares most of that blame. Now, I want to go to the question of how Eisenhower's speech played out at the time. Did it get much attention? Did it have much of an impact? And how did it go on to become such a famous speech that is remembered now? Today is the 50th anniversary of that speech, and there's a lot of news coverage of that speech. Not a lot of other speeches get that sort of attention. Why did this one become so important?
Very good question. First part of the question has to do with the reception of the speech. Eisenhower, 3 days before John Kennedy was inaugurated, when he delivered this speech, he had suffered a heart attack, he had suffered a stroke. His speech delivery, never great to begin with, was greatly diminished. And I think it's fair to say, although the speech was, of course, covered as an official event, it was not a major preoccupation for most people in the immediate aftermath. Because the sexy, dynamic John Kennedy was coming into the White House, younger, different party, different priorities, different set of values. Nonetheless, the speech did find its fans in sort of pockets of America, but which ended up being very important. For example, the 1962 Port Huron Statement, the kind of founding document of Students for a Democratic Society, which in itself was a template for what would become the student movement of the late 60s and 70s, has a whole section on the military-industrial complex. And Tom Hayden, who helped draft that document, has told me and has said elsewhere that Eisenhower's speech, along with the work of C. Wright Mills, was exactly what he was thinking about when he drafted the Port Huron Statement, and it's cited by name in the document itself. Earl Warren, who was the chief Supreme Court justice at the time, gave a fascinating speech in 1963 in which he talked about the Supreme Court and military authority and individual rights. He also cited the speech. Martin Luther King made the military-industrial complex part of his sermons in the early 1960s. But it's really not until the full-scale American involvement in Vietnam, beginning with 65, the troop escalations in 65 and 66, 67, that you begin to see the term kind of harken back to with a lot of power. And then after that, you get what I call almost like a military-industrial complex studies program, where you have all these different experts, the Institute for Policy Studies, Center for Economic Priorities, parts of the Quaker Church, looking at all these different aspects of the military-industrial complex, and that, I think, put down enough roots and created enough momentum that the speech and the concept kind of lodged itself permanently in our minds. Very much part of the anti-war movement, and then later very influential in beginning what was called socially responsible investing. You get a whole bunch of people saying, well, the military and industry are so combined, I don't want my investments or my employer to be connected to the military, so I'm going to take actions X, Y, and Z.
But that's an interesting point in your book, is that the birth of socially responsible investing really does begin with a response to the defense contractors and Dow Chemical, the disinvestment movement of the universities.
Absolutely.
And I find it interesting, Jim, that the recent CSR movement has not really focused very much on defense, the defense industry. You don't hear a lot about corporate social responsibility being focused on, the companies that make weapons. There's more, companies that run sweatshops or companies that hurt the environment.
Sustainability.
So how is it that the left and those interested in CSR sort of stopped demonizing the defense contractors, pretty much sort of let them off the hook, and really shifted their attention elsewhere in that the focus on social responsible.
I think it has primarily to do with the end of the Cold War. That sort of took the sting out of the contentiousness out of the notions of military spending. I think you'll find some of the larger CSR mutual funds, for example, still have a screen for direct military spending. But you're right, there are very few of the prominent ones who want to, who make it their point to draw the connections between military spending and the rest of the society. And I think partly, not that I've not examined this point that closely, but I think you'll find if you look really closely, you'll find very little to invest in. The companies that are going to provide the best returns, a big chunk of the companies that are considered socially responsible are some of the big technology companies. But some of the big technology companies are the ones supplying the systems for the Pentagon, right? Presumably, the Pentagon, the entire nuclear chain of command really couldn't exist without AT&T and once upon a time Western Union. There are only so many ways to sort of connect things across the country, especially back in the 60s and 70s, and the telephone and telegraph companies were the major way to do that. And this remains the case. You still have connections between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley. So if you take out that chunk, right, you take out a big chunk of the manufacturing base, what are you left with to invest in? So I think that's one of the big problems. But I want to get back to the second part of your last question, which is why the speech endures. And I think one of the reasons why we're still talking about it 50 years later has to do with Eisenhower himself. It's a kind of great surprise, if not shock, that the man who was a 5-star general, the man who was twice president, was at the very pinnacle of both the military and American politics, that he would deliver such a sweeping critique, and I think that takes you to the second point, which is even regardless of Eisenhower's military connections, the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief. It's pretty rare for the Commander-in-Chief to give a public speech that's critical of the military in any way. The usual thing is to wrap yourself in the flag, surround yourself with as many soldiers as possible. Got to support the troops, got to support the military. It's very, very rare. And you have to go back to the 18th century to really find this kind of criticism of the idea of militarizing society. And I think that uniqueness when we confront the issues that still confront us, we come back to that. I mean, I think one of the measures by which, one of the yardsticks by which you can say this is a truly great speech, is that the people today who want to criticize the military-industrial complex and the people today who would kind of defend it on various grounds, they would still use the standards that Eisenhower laid out in that speech 50 years ago. The kind of arsenal of democracy part, which is there in his speech, and then the military-industrial complex. Those two poles are nearly identical to the poles that exist today. It's only the details that are different.
Well, I think that's probably a good note on which to end our conversation. Really fascinating book. I hope it gets a lot of attention, and hopefully we won't still be talking about the speech 75 years from now, and we'll have a significantly downsized military-industrial complex. Jim, thanks a lot.
Thank you, David.